Thanks a lot for having me. Stakes are, they're measured in the tens of trillions, just as an economic matter. And if anything, that understates the size of the problem because of how the cost of the Great Recession was. If you lost your job, it was devastating. If you didn't, it was not much worse than unfortunate. And it reverberated, as many economic crises do, into the political sector. So there's lots of evidence that really bad recessions and financial crises lead to political polarization, and in particular towards right-wing populism. And this round of financial and economic crises was no exception. So it's a big social problem. I'll leave it at that. What do you do in response to this type of problem? One thing to do is wait it out. Do nothing. Do nothing as a policy matter. Kind of hope it goes away. Accept this as a very painful but unavoidable feature of capitalism. And if you're sufficiently pessimistic about the capacity of policy, then that's often where you'll come out. I don't mock this. I think that this is, there's a reason people say this. It's not because they think it's great. It's just they think it's better than the alternatives. But that has not been the dominant approach in the world since the Great Depression. The number one approach to economic crises is to basically monetary policy. Print a lot of money. Print a lot of money and lower interest rates, get the problem to go away. Is the primary idea. Milton Friedman is largely associated with that, but many, many others. And of course, Keynes argued that the way to handle a deep recession where the economy is not producing at capacity because of inadequate spending, or the fancy term is aggregate demand, he argued that the way to solve that problem is to have the government take up the private sector slack. So direct government spending and or tax cuts to leave more money in private sector pockets, and get the tax cuts, get private sector spending going, and direct government spending spends it directly. These are the dominant alternatives. They're much praised, used, but they were inadequate in the Great Recession, and there's reason to think they'll be inadequate for future economic problems, such as the one that seems to be beginning in Europe right now. And there's even weakness here in the U.S. So the goal of law and macroeconomics is to say, is there something else to use when monetary and fiscal don't work or are inadequate? And I argue that law, and more than law, really regulation, offers a whole suite of tools that can promote aggregate demand when needed. They haven't been used, but the point of the book is to argue that they should be in appropriate circumstances. So that's number one. Number two, which I'll emphasize much less here, is law also plays a really important role in the formulation of monetary and fiscal policy itself. But that's not what I'm going to emphasize here. So monetary policy works really well as raising interest rates is actually a very effective way to mitigate inflation. It works somewhat less well when the problem is not enough spending. But even there, so long as interest rates are high enough, you can just keep lowering interest rates in order to, the idea is you lower interest rates, you promote investment, you promote spending, you get more of it. monetary policy really runs into a problem at the zero lower bound. When interest rates hit zero, as they did during the Great Recession and the Great Depression, and as they have in Japan for the last 30 or 40 years, you can't just lower interest rates. The problem is if you lower interest rates to negative numbers, people will start hoarding cash. They'll start trying to prepay all sorts of things. Our tax system is premised on the idea that interest rates are not negative. So there's all sorts of reasons why interest rates sort of can't be negative without massive changes. So then there's much less you can do. You can't simply lower interest rates. What the Fed did instead, and most central banks did instead, was they just started almost literally printing money, buying long-term bonds to bring long-term rates, which hadn't yet hit zero, down to zero. And you can see how much they did that in this figure. They printed, without any law being changed or anything like that, many trillions of dollars. It really was unprecedented, but this is exactly what Milton Friedman would tell you to do. The problem with this is that it doesn't work all that well. If it does start to work, there's a very, very thin line between it working and running into significant inflation. You can't just print money. If you printed $100 trillion, at some point inflation would result. And there's also it puts an extraordinary amount of power into unelected hands. Just for example, the 3 or 4 trillion that the Fed printed, roughly 4 trillion, is bigger than the annual sort of federal revenue take from all sources of revenue. So without any change in law, they were just able to buy that amount of bond. So it's concerning, and more importantly, it just doesn't work that well. If it worked great, fine, but it doesn't. In some places, it's even illegal. The second mode of response is fiscal policy. And people often distinguish between automatic and discretionary policy. Automatic policy is government spending that automatically increases or taxes that automatically decrease in a recession. And that is considered sort of a really good thing. And that happened a lot during the Great Recession. Another thing that people often do, if that's not enough, so income taxes by definition go down when income goes lower. So in 2009, income taxes, even if there had been no legal changes, they would have been much lower than in 2007, let's say. So that works really well. What if that's not enough? What if they're still missing, let's say spending sort of all of a sudden goes down by a couple of trillion and tax only makes up for 200 billion of that. So then you can start passing laws to promote investment, and in 2009 we did a lot of that here in the US, and it worked okay. It was nowhere near equal to the size and scope of the problem, and people think that's an endemic problem. That's something that because people are afraid of debt, because the democratic process for passing fiscal policy is long and slow, that it's foolish, and because in states and in European nations, they're not allowed to run deficits. Or if they are, they're only allowed to run deficits up to a certain amount of point. Bottom line is, it doesn't work that well. So my advice there is for your purposes, not all that much, other than to say that to the extent we can enhance automatic stabilization, that's a very good thing. And there's one thing that people haven't realized that is worth noting is that there's a lot of unintentionally pro-cyclical fiscal policy out there. So to give you an example, let's say there is a tax credit for solar panels. And like most things in the economy, people invest more in solar panels when times are good than when times are bad. So what does that mean for effective government policy in terms of subsidizing solar panels? So what that means is that in a boom time where people are investing a lot, including in solar panels, the implicit foregone government revenue is pretty high, right? They're giving a lot of credits on solar panels or any other environmentally efficient investment that people are just making because times are good. Then times get bad, people cut back on the investment. What that effectively means is that the government is spending functionally less on subsidizing subsidizing solar panels or whatever it may be. It's hard to imagine if the government were buying panels itself, for example. It's hard to imagine that it would say, we want to buy a lot of panels in good times, but in bad times when we need spending, we're going to buy less. But functionally, that's what's happening. And there's a lot of programs that have this policy that need to be changed. But I want to get more directly to things that have yes. One thing that I haven't seen talked about very much. So in general, people say like change income taxes for the business cycle. That's a widely agreed upon thing. You hear much less about Pigouvian taxes, like a carbon tax. So what's the idea here? The idea here is that not the harm, let's say, of carbon, the harm associated with carbon emissions, that's pretty constant throughout the business cycle. We could find ways where it isn't, but especially with something like climate change, this is such a long-term thing that that is relatively fixed. But the sort of the social cost of collecting that revenue is varying over the business cycle. You want to leave more money in people's hands in bus, and if you can do it through income taxes, that's great. But it's also the logic of cutting taxes in bus is not limited to that. It would also apply to a carbon tax. One thing that, like, for example, I haven't seen done very much is I know there's a lot of literature comparing a carbon tax to something like cap and trade or more direct regulation. I haven't seen much on comparing their stabilization properties, which is better from a business cycle perspective. And I submit, I don't know this, and someone would need to really look into it. But we can imagine a cap and trade with an auction actually being more countercyclical. The idea being that the prices of carbon permits might go way down in a bust, and then up a lot in a boom, in a way that a simple carbon tax would fluctuate much less with the course of the business cycle. From a stabilization perspective, you really like things that collect a lot of revenue in boom times and relatively little in bust. That's just speculation. I don't know, but it's just something to be considered. Another point to make is something like the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, I would say its sort of economic efficiency is highly business cycle sensitive. When the economy is healthy, I don't think it's a very effective way to help the environment. There are much less costly ways. We want to do it through something like Pigouvian taxation or something like that. But in a bust, like in the Great Recession, for example, the question wasn't really how do we optimally mitigate carbon emissions. We had bigger problems, like people not being employed and things like that. So if the Green New Deal would take people, would move people from unemployment to employment, the fact that they're not employed in the most efficient possible job is a second order concern, right? The first order concern is non-employment to employment. That's the primary market failure. And then the fact that this is not the best way of going about it, that matters, but that's a much bigger concern in the boom where there's not a fundamental unemployment problem. The problem is much more allocating people to their right jobs or resources to their best use. So I think, and again, just the term Green New Deal. The New Deal was not meant to be forever. It was a response to an economic crisis. And I think, so I think developing the plan makes a lot of sense. It would be much, much more economically efficient to come up with it to use it in the next recession. And there's a lot of reason to think that we're not ready for the next recession, in large part because here we are today. Unemployment is at record lows, and long-term interest rates are below 2.5%. So it is practically certain that in the next recession, whenever it comes, we will need badly. We'll hit the zero lower bound pretty darn quickly, and once we hit the lower bound, we're going to be we're going to be without many tools to stimulate the economy. So we need to think of other things. And this is where I think expansionary law and regulation to promote spending in busts and possibly making it up in booms is most useful. I don't think it's our first line of macro policy. I don't even really think it's our second line of macro policy. But considering 1 and 2 are really hard to use, it behooves us to think of other instruments. And I'd actually like to argue that the notion of using the law to stimulate the economy is not different in kind from the basic idea of fiscal stimulus. So in law and economics, there's a pretty strong relationship between regulations and tax and or spending. So first, a regulation as a tax. So what is a ban? If you ban something, you're taxing it ad infinity. So if we say, well, fiscal policy, regular taxation, should change in accord with the business cycle, there is a relatively compelling argument for using the legal and regulatory system to behave similarly. Now, I want to emphasize that it's not always regulation as tax. Many regulations, and particularly mandates, are much more tax and spend than tax. So if, for example, we mandate that power plants need to install pollution scrubbers, what we're functionally doing is we're taxing them equal to the value of the scrubbers, and then we're spending equal to that. That, by the way, can, depending on elasticities of spending, that can promote spending. So broadly speaking, I would say that bans, depending on the context, are relatively less attractive in recessions, and mandates are relatively more attractive in recessions, in bad recessions, where the interest rate is zero, than they would be otherwise. But I just want you to follow the basic analogy here, that fiscal policy, we have many alternatives to fiscal policy. We use those alternatives all the time for other goals of government spending and or taxation. I'm arguing that we should do the same for business cycle goals. And to draw the analogy even stronger, there's a sense here in which we are, so fiscal policy is borrowing from the future, having the government pay back in the future to spend now. There is an analog with, we are literally borrowing from the environment now to pay it back in the future. Now, one very real concern about this is, what if you don't ever pay it back? It's a great idea, but if you just go ahead and loosen up in the good times, maybe it'll be very hard to loosen up in the bad times. Maybe it'll be hard to tighten, and indeed tighten more in the good times. And that's a real concern. And indeed, that's an important concern about fiscal policy. Why do states? Because they're afraid that we'll be good at deficit spending in the bad times, but we'll be bad at paying back and making it up in the good times. So they say, we're not going to stabilize the economy with fiscal policy. It is a reasonable position to say, I just don't want to go there. I don't have enough. But it's not because it's a theoretically bad mechanism. It's just if you don't have confidence in our institutional mechanisms to adjust policy, then you may just say like this would be nice, but it's just too hard. And that's a very legitimate concern. I'd like to emphasize that this should never be, business cycle consideration should never be the only factor. It should be one factor among many. If something is going to trash the environment, then even if it's going to help the business cycle, it's probably not worth it, is the idea. It's for things that are on the margin. It's only where you're on other dimensions, you're in a gray area, then I would argue that the case for whatever that is stronger in the bust than in the boom. And that leads naturally. There are some things where borrowing is more feasible than others. If you borrow from a species and it goes extinct, then you can't pay it back in the future. So there needs to be some subtlety on where and when to use this. It's not right for everything, and that would go into the calculus. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to give two examples, and then I will wrap up. So the first example is the Keystone pipeline. I have nothing to add on the environmental side. Whatever you thought before, you should continue to think. But I want to emphasize that the debate, the primary debate over Keystone in the Obama administration was in 2009, 2010, 2011. So this is during a construction depression. Construction is notoriously pro-cyclical. It was highly depressed in 2009 and 2010. Really is when this really went on. And so Keystone was a private stimulus package. Here you had a private company that, without changing the deficit at all, was going to invest. And the short term, the construction jobs, were going to be in the tens of thousands. So it was a substantial, in the tens of billions of a stimulus package. And that, the benefit. So let's say we were doing. So the bottom line is, I want to say, let's say we were doing a cost-benefit analysis of Keystone. Ordinarily, in ordinary times, if someone comes to you and says there are going to be 15,000 people working on this project, that should not sway you. Why? Because you shouldn't think that if it weren't for this project, 15,000 people would be unemployed. No, they would be employed. They'd be employed doing something else, right? If Keystone gets built today, it's not because it's going to be using a lot of unemployed workers. It's mostly, not entirely, but mostly going to be using workers who would be building something else. But in 2010, that's not true. In 2010, let's say a rough estimate, about 40% of those workers were unemployed otherwise, without Keystone, but would have been employed then. So there, if someone tells you in 2010 we're going to be employing workers, that's for free. those workers are otherwise sitting idle. Unemployment is a disease. So you're helping, here's a private sector company offering to heal, not out of altruistic motives, but offering to mitigate that. So I would argue that the case for Keystone was much stronger in 2010 than it would be now, or that it was in 2006. That doesn't mean it should be decisive. If you think that it's a disaster, then it probably still is a disaster, even if you sort of view the cost of construction as free or as 40% free or something like that from a social perspective. If the environmental harm is bad enough, it doesn't matter. But I just want you to see that the case is stronger. That's the point. And this is true generically about any spending project. The true social cost, the cost-benefit analysis needs to be adjusted for the business cycle. The true cost of something is different in booms and busts. And I like to emphasize that here this is a deregulatory. What I've been making so far is a deregulatory argument, but it doesn't have to be. So, for example, another thing you could do with Keystone is Keystone, when it saw that it was unlikely to happen, started offering solutions to some of people's concerns, particularly on spillage. They started offering to build sort of a more expensive pipeline to reduce the probability of spillage. I would say that the case for something like that, the cost-benefit analysis of that more expensive pipeline, is stronger in 2010 than it would be today, and the logic is the same. That is promoting spending. Even more workers would be engaged in that more expensive pipeline project, and so there it is possible to with mandates to both protect the environment and to encourage spending. So I think that that's something worth considering. My last example, and with this I'll wrap up, is what I call countercyclical utility regulation. So how does utility regulation work today? It more to a first approximation. It's obviously much more complicated than this, but when utility companies are making substandard returns, they request higher rates and not otherwise. And there's, again, this is a caricature, but it is not entirely false. What happens? What does that mean during a recession? In a recession, what happens? Electricity demand plummets, or it doesn't plummet. It goes down like everything goes down. What does that mean? If you're a utility and you have high fixed costs, your fixed costs remain the same. If electricity demand goes down, you're making less, you have the same fixed costs, your returns go down. You go to the regulator, you tell them we need to raise rates in order to get a competitive return. And if you look at this, and I've done even some more subtle examples, in the last two recessions, utility rates have gone up significantly, and electricity rates have actually gone way down. So this is at a time when wholesale rates are going down, residential rates are going way up because of this utility dynamic. From a stabilization perspective, that's a disaster. Because what it functionally means is that prices are being raised on utility consumers in order to protect returns of utility investors. Utilities are a very big expense for the poor. The poor have the highest propensity to spend. So this functions as a tax increase that overwhelmingly hits the poor. It's a regressive tax increase in a recession that reduces spending And that's a bad idea. At a time when we're trying to increase spending with all sorts of other measures of policy, our utility regulation is actually pushing the other way. It's taking money out of the hands of the people most likely to spend and putting that money in the hands of investors who are less likely to spend. Investors, by definition, have access to capital. They're much more able to smooth their spending over the course of a business cycle. So the proposal here would be to alter utility regulation so that instead of promising sort of adequate returns year by year, that you would promise adequate returns over the business cycle. So what the regulator would do then, and of course regulation is a government-controlled price, the regulator would hold rates down in bus, like in 2010, and then allow them to rise in the boom. And so basically the opposite of this. So get it to go down here, here's the Great Recession, get it to go down here, and then allow it perhaps here to be above where it would be otherwise, in order for the utility investors to at least get a competitive return. You can't have something for nothing. And again, it's kind of like debt. So what you're doing is consumers are functionally borrowing, they're running up a debt to the utility investors in the bust that they're going to pay off in the boom. And why is that a good idea? Because the utility consumers don't have access to, they would like to borrow, they can't in the bust. So any way we can socially make their borrowing easier in the bust, the better. Now, this is not perfect. One concern you might have is how would this affect utility investment in the bust? If they would otherwise have invested in all sorts of wonderful things, the utilities, and now they're not, then making it harder for them to do that potentially is a problem. So two responses. One is that, first of all, they still have access to capital, the utilities. So it's not like investment has become impossible. The goal is not to actually lower their total return. It's to, over the business cycle, it should be constant. So that's one response. The second response is, as a functional matter, utilities don't invest that much in recessions. Demand is less. When demand is less in recessions, they feel less of an imperative to consider new sources of electricity. Now, there are all sorts of other things that utility are doing. Energy efficiency, for example. Mandates on energy efficiency. That's something that is worth considering. And it could well be that, if the utility says, like, listen, don't lower our rates, we're going to invest this much more than we were planning on in energy conservation, then the regulator has the leeway to consider that. But as a first go round, I think that this is something worth considering. The stakes are enormous, right? Utility spending in the U.S. is well over $1 trillion. So it's on the order of, it's an important part of GDP, and it's a part of GDP that is, again, particularly concentrated in the spending is particularly concentrated among the poor, much more so than any type of tax. Okay, so now just to wrap up, I agree that this can be a mess as an institutional matter. Now, utility regulators may be a good place to start because they're relatively nimble. They're somewhat insulated from the political process. We may have more confidence in them to be able to do this than a legislature might. So, but I imagine that we'll talk about this in Q&A. But I recognize that it's a mess. But I also want to emphasize, what is the alternative? The alternative what we did in 2010 was we didn't do much. Or the Fed did a lot, and no one else did that much. And that didn't work out so well. It was terrible for those who were unemployed, and it was terrible for the country. It really did throw a wrench in our politics. So just remember the stakes. Only use this when you need it. It's not the first line of defense. It's not the second line of defense, but it's out there for when it's needed. And it makes macro policy more robust to failures in any one. Relying entirely on a central bank is a risky strategy. What happens if they can't act, or even if they can act but won't act? The economy is incredibly vulnerable. Something like this would reduce that vulnerability. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to questions.
So your ideas around utility regulation change?
Mm-hmm.
What are the chances you think investors would go for that kind of?
I don't think investors will like it. But again, depending on, they could be made to like it. Part of the premise here is that they're better bearers of recession risk than utility consumers are. If they are offered enough of a return in the good times, then there is some level at which they would be on board. So the devil is in the details here. But it's not theoretically impossible for them to be on board. It just has to be done correctly.
Have you been able to socialize this idea at all? And get any reactions? Okay.
I've just started trying to, to publicize it. And, people don't, it doesn't see, I've spoken to a bunch of, energy regulatory attorneys, stuff like that, and they don't think that this is impossible. Any change is, it's always better to bet the under on change. But it's not dead on arrival, is how I would describe it. So, and that alone, by the way, would be a substantial change.
And then one last follow-up to that. So in this kind of regulation, would you be attacking the definition of business cycle on certain macroeconomic indicators, certain number of years, other
Yes, and I would argue, I actually read the Connecticut statutes, and they're already relatively vague. It says that there needs to be a, no more than but no less than a competitive return. But it's not like it says every year or something like that. There's already some scope. And of course, utility returns do change year by year, right? They're not quite fixed. They're trying to keep them as fixed as possible. So there's already, and there's all sorts of things that the regulator is supposed to consider. The environment famously, but not just, they're supposed to consider the state's economy and the public interest. So there's some room. I think ideally this would be put into the statute, but I don't think it has to be. I think there's already enough room there for at least some movement.
I was just going to say that I wonder the extent to which that already happens with many utilities because they're sort of regulated industries and they get a guaranteed rate of return. So maybe and then they sort of have they have to petition for rate changes. I mean, they can't. Most of them can't just change their rates. They've got
Agreed.
So it's sort of like maybe the planning horizon now is 2 or 3 years, and you're just arguing that you should expand the planning horizon longer.
Yeah, potentially plan, or I don't want to see this.
I don't know the breakdown, but most places in the country that can't happen. They don't just float up the utility rates because they're regulated. So it's not like the rates that people are paying.
No, I agree.
Right?
No, I agree. No, I don't. What I think happens is the next time there is a rate consideration or something like that, they go to the regulator and they say, here's our numbers, and this is why under the statute we are entitled to a rate increase. And I think the regulator pushes back, but I think the way we understand the regulatory standards as is, that's a reason, that's one factor pushing towards an increase.
Is that for the whole country?
Yes, that's for the whole country. And again, when you look at like wholesale, if you buy electricity on the open market, obviously there's many different wholesale prices based on where you are in the country. But to the extent I've seen 2 or 3, those don't have this pattern. It is not looking like that. And I don't want to say this is not sort of proven causal relationship, but even if if this is happening anyway, I think they're not trying hard enough. Would be like, you really would not want to see this. Is the idea.
So I have 2 comments. One, I think that there are probably nonlinearities in things kind of like the zero lower bound in environmental systems, specifically with respect to the carbon price, that would make your statement about carbon damages kind of being long run a little bit more complicated than just saying we might be able to borrow here again during bust time. So that's kind of my first comment. My second is that there are probably dynamic benefits to be had from directing policies aimed at increasing aggregate demand towards more environmentally friendly, less carbon intensive. I mean, especially when we know that Pigouvian taxes shouldn't be distortionary. There might be other ways that we can direct our efforts. And 2 examples that come to mind are Civilian Conservation Corps, which kind of reshaped the national parks for the country during a time when we were recovering, and also Cash for Clunkers, which aggregate demand increase in a direction that had long-term kind of dynamic benefits in the space of carbon emissions and
Yes, so I am like unabashedly pro. So first let me answer your first. So I think your first question is yes, like if you are at a sort of at a tipping point, then there's no borrowing. And yes, then then you shouldn't do it. Is the argument. So that on one, there are going to be plenty of cases where it's not appropriate, and it depends on what the context is. But I'm not here to say that doesn't really matter. It does really matter. And then on the second, yes, emphatically, and this is like on the Green New Deal type of thing, a really good thing to spend on in a bust is, and we did that sort of as you indicated in 2009, but we could do it more. We could do it. You can imagine if Cash for Clunkers scares people because it requires spending. You could even imagine, as they do in Japan, just having tougher regulation on clunkers, in the next 2 years, saying like everyone needs to have a car that only hits X emissions within the next couple of years. I guarantee you there'll be a lot of cars bought. I guarantee you that it'll be regressive and all sorts of other things. But if the goal is to get people to buy cars now, then something like that can, then without increasing spending, something like that can absolutely work. There's no free lunches, but it's something worth considering. And that's why I said, like the Green New Deal. If the alternative is a Green New Deal or massive unemployment, then the Green New Deal is a better option, even if you hate like a lot of the sort of central planning element. It's still, again, compared to what? Please.
You talked about some of the practical limitations in like fiscal policy and monetary policy. When you think about regulatory mechanisms, as you've described here, what are some just, outside of specific policies, what are some broad systematic changes that you think inhibit the system from being able to use and implement some of these kind of regulatory mechanisms that you'd like to see?
So I actually think one thing is, and I know this from teaching in a law school, the people who are mostly implementing these things are no one ever mentions macroeconomics to them. It's just sort of like it's considered outside like the policy realm. Like there's tons of policy talk in, like if you told a judge that they should be concerned about the environment, they'd say yes. If they should be concerned about macroeconomic efficiency, they would say yes. If you told a judge they should be concerned about the macroeconomy, they'd look at you funny. So I think that's already hard. So I think that's one thing that gets in the way. And so one of my hopes is just like it doesn't sound as crazy next time there's a recession. So that's sort of one of my goals here, is that like it's kind of out there. It's viewed as, it's not your main job. You know, it would be crazy if judges started thinking, or regulators started thinking, you know, my main goal, you know, my job in life is stopping recessions. But there's a long ways between that and where we're at now, where it's just sort of, you know, not my problem, nothing to see here. So I think that's part of it.
Do you want to follow up on this topic?
And you know, and then there's a general, you know, lawyers especially, we're really conservative. You know, we're temperamentally afraid of change for lots of good reasons. And again, and if people want to say that, you know, it's not worth it, it's too much of a mess, I get it. I can't tell you sort of you're wrong. But again, I just think the stakes are so big that it's worth. Like when I see what has happened in the wake of the Great Recession, I think like, you know, no, this is an urgent matter, rather than something we can kind of work through.
Sort of following up on that, so you mentioned how 2008, 2009, the Fed was the only one acting, and you're trying to use this a legal framework to make it so it's not just the Fed acting, but you were just talking about judges and a lot of the legal sector aren't really familiar with macroeconomics and how to pull these levers. So how do you want to get the legal legislative sector more on board with this, and what, like, besides these two examples, like what other like legal legislative levers are there to pull besides just the Fed?
Sure. So I think that that regulation is much better suited to this than individual, like case by case, you know, judicial adjudication. So I think regulators, you know, have much more access to expertise and things like this. So one thing I talk about in the book is, you know, are there ways we can systemize like macroeconomic expertise within a government so that they can signal like, hey, everyone, we're in one of those times that where you need to be thinking about this. Go ahead and do it. Is the type of thing I would imagine. And actually, one thing that was fascinating for me is researching this is that while it seems weird now, there was a time where it seemed really natural. So Nixon and Ford, kind of the precursor of cost-benefit analysis of regulatory action, is what's called an inflation impact statement. So in the 70s, they were really concerned about inflation, and they didn't think it was crazy for the regulatory state to worry about inflation. So they actually instructed all agencies to consider inflation as they were developing this policy. And the precursor to OIRA is sort of these people evaluating inflation impacts. So it's in the system. So like in a place like OIRA, or in its own, I'm always hesitant. It's always good to have an agency where this is their job. So I would imagine like some office where like their job is to think about this always, and then when a recession, you know, when a bad enough recession comes, for them to be explaining to everyone like, hey, now's the time. So that's a way to coordinate much better than just on like a true case-by-case basis.
If we have time for one more question.
I don't know when I'm supposed to end, so.
In one talk, you mentioned two really interesting words. I mean, certainly macroeconomics, but from the natural science point of view, the word extinct, the extinct species you put in there. So I'm not going to follow this carefully, so please correct me as I go along. It seems to me that if a species goes extinct, that's proof that we overborrowed in the past. Okay? So let's say the natural scientist is willing to say, what's happening now is going to lead to the 50% chance of extinction now if we keep borrowing. At what point, I'm trying to get you as the economist to say, whoa, we have to stop borrowing now because something is going to go extinct. And this is especially current with this sort of climate change things where people think in not future generations, but the generation, the younger people that are sitting in front of you now, that climate change is going to affect the equivalent of extinct, but for climate. So doesn't that prove that we actually are borrowing way too much for growth and development? That's a proposal for you to try to link these two terms together. Thank you.
Yes. So I am not unsympathetic to that idea. I would, and valuing species, for example, in cost-benefit analysis is an incredibly thorny problem. And then to evaluate probabilities of loss, these are incredibly thorny problems. But if the argument is that listen, we're so far away from the optimum on various environmental policies that even if the case for loosening those policies is stronger in a bust than a boom, that it still doesn't trump everything else, then that makes sense. Then what I would tell you is that you have an opportunity here, because the argument for mandates, the argument for investment in environmental remediation and improvement, the argument is stronger in a bust than in a boom. So take advantage of that. There are other people who will sort of hear that argument in a way they wouldn't hear your broader argument that we've overborrowed in general. You could say, if they think, no, we have it about right, well then in a bust, there's space for you to perhaps make some inroads there, like on mandates and things like that. So, all right. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it.